So my project has to do with digital storytelling. What I'm going to do is walk you through basically the steps of the educational technology process around digital storytelling. So we're going to start with a little bit of context. So as you know, storytelling has been around for a long time. People have been telling stories to each other since the dawn of time. Obviously, some more truthful than others, but we spend a good part of every day telling each other stories, and each conversation we have is a story unto itself. Storytelling is at the core of the human experience and has evolved over many years to ensure our survival. But I think the main purpose behind it now, more than ever, is to pass along information. And digital storytelling is a further extension of traditional storytelling where we use digital tools to help with that process. It's a combination of art and technology, using graphics, audio, and video, and it's been around for a few decades now. As for the rationale behind why you would want to use this, there is a lot of research out there, and there's kind of two avenues with digital storytelling. You can use it as an instructor to provide information to your learner, or you can have your learner use it to provide a narrative for something that they're learning. I'm an instructional designer and e-learning developer, and I was formerly a media arts instructor. My day consists of building content for courses using course authoring software and creative software. And one of the most important parts of my job is to make learning meaningful and memorable. And often that means scenario-based learning or learning that revolves around stories of some kind. So my clients really vary, whether it's the federal government or healthcare, nonprofits, large corporations, post-secondary institutions. They all use storytelling in the learning that they want to produce because it's simply something that people get engaged with, and it's memorable. One interesting thing to note that in some of the research I looked into, digital storytelling was used for research. And so people were putting together stories in a digital format to provide to an audience to get data from. And so it works in many, many different ways. Anyway, going back to the process of evaluating digital storytelling, means that part of that process is vetting. And so when we look at digital storytelling, we have to think about digital equity and software and hardware. And so digital equity, in a nutshell, is just meaning that we have an equal playing field for students. And so when we go into a classroom, say in a school, everyone's got desks. If it's a computer lab, they've all got computers. They all have the same software. They all have the same opportunity to learn in the same way with the same tools. And what has changed recently is that some students are using their own devices with their own software. So we have to keep that in mind. But if we're working in the school using school hardware and software, there's a process. There's a process about who gets to decide what gets purchased and how it gets used. And sometimes that's teachers, sometimes that's tech, sometimes that's admin, maybe it's a combination of those, but it's all going to be different in each institution. So that's something people need to be aware of. Not only do we need to consider costs and budgets and training and technical support, we need to understand what actually needs to go into a digital story. So there are mediums that we use within that. Now, Tony Bates talks about that in his book, Teaching in a Digital Age. And so the mediums that we use in digital storytelling are pretty straightforward. There's textual information, so that is the actual text. So that means for design considerations, you have fonts, and that means you choose size, color, layout, all that sort of stuff. There's the auditory side of it, and so audio can consist of narration, dialogue, sound effects, music, or a combination of those things. Then there's the images themselves, and they can be raster or vector images. Raster images are your photographs or scan media. Vector images are your 2D or 3D, and it can be a combination of all of those things. And so that's something else that you need to think about. Can the software create these particular items. And the last couple things is video and animation. And of course, video could be lots of different things too. It could be footage of people, places, things, demonstrations, interviews, sky's the limit with it. And same with animation. We can do character-based animation, or we can do object-based animation. Now, if you don't know the difference between those two, character-based is like your Saturday morning cartoons. Object-based is like when you create a PowerPoint and you have something animated on the screen. The other thing to consider is the principles and elements of design and composition, and of course they play a big role in choosing things like your color and other items that go along with your theme. But what we really need to consider is, is the items that I just mentioned, are those mediums something that you're going to be able to create with the software and hardware that you have? And if not, if you're going to rely on students to do that, how are you going to pull them in order to figure out what they have and whether they're capable of creating what you're asking? Now, the other part of the consideration here when it comes to vetting is the type of communication and distribution. So there's lots of different ways stories can be distributed and communicated to an audience. We can do it as a one-way communication where it's a story presented to an audience straight up, or two-way where it is like a prompt for more stories like Flipgrid. There could be the asynchronous piece where it's something that's just out there on a website, or maybe it's a YouTube video, so there's no live introduction or comments. There's the face-to-face or virtual, which is a live-led story presentation for an audience. And then the other part of it is it an individual or collaborative experience? And if that's the case, if it's individual, what software do they need? And if it's collaborative, do they actually need to work on the same software at the same time? And so that's something else to consider when you're doing that vetting piece. It is a multi-step process, and it means that there are certain procedures that you need to follow. So the thing about digital storytelling is there's no prescribed set of steps. There's lots of people who say that they have steps out there that you can use, like Lambert and Hessler's have their 7 steps for creating a digital story. Adobe has their own version. One that I found here from Qua says, the process of digital storytelling involves steps such as coming up with an idea, writing, storyboarding, gathering materials, putting it all together, editing, and sharing. And that is 100% correct. That is probably the most simple way you can put it. So the first step is that digital story. And I think this is the trickiest part in the whole procedure, is how do you create a story? How do you teach creativity? And that's a whole other thing altogether. But I think what's really important for people to understand is if you want an engaging story that is going to keep an audience captive, then it needs to be something that is honest. It needs to be humanized. And so it needs to contain media that evoke real feelings, that is something that people can relate to. And really, it is something that's told from the heart and not the head. Because if it's flat and bland and impersonal, people are going to tune out. They're not going to pay attention to it. It's not going to have any worth to anybody. So I always think of storytelling like telling a secret. Okay, you've got a secret, and people want to know what that secret is. And your story lets them in on that secret. That secret is something you probably wouldn't normally advertise. It's something about you that people might not know. And telling a good story is empowering because you get to control how much of that secret you reveal. And I think that's an important piece. Now, I have an assignment and an evaluation rubric for a course that I used to teach in media arts that I'll share at the end of this that has more information about this. But just to make things more concise, we'll go through the next few steps rather quickly. Step 2 is that planning piece where you get to storyboard and decide, all the places that you're going to gather your media and when you're going to do it, and organizing your files. And then there's the building of the content. It's putting it all together, putting your photos or images and text and everything into an edited piece. And then finally, there's that presentation where you get to show it to your audience, it gets evaluated, and hopefully you've built in some sort of reflection mechanism for students as well. So I think best practice is that if you want students to produce something good as a digital story, you need to show them it. You need to show learners everything: the software, the hardware, exemplars from past students or other people, and then the assessments. The assessments got to be clear. And that is really the next step in the procedure. So assessments split into kind of two areas, right? So there's assessment of the digital storytelling experience, from an instructional standpoint, and then there's the assessment of a digital story itself as a student building it. And they both require some creative process, but I think what needs to be important is that when you look at it from the student side, if you're grading a student's digital story, it needs to have a transparent and fair method of marking that relies on competencies rather than arbitrary artistic merits. Okay, I think that's something that I will definitely argue up and down on. Competencies are key to these types of assessments. So marking on things like effort is not really going to be accurate or measurable because everybody has different levels of effort. And so it's kind of like artistic ability, right? Some people are good at art and some people are not. They have to work hard. So we mark on competencies, and you'll see in the rubric that I have, how it's broken down. Anyway, just to continue on, the digital storytelling piece as an assessment from an instructional standpoint is that analyzing the worth of it as an institution. And so when you look at the digital storytelling as an instructional tool, does it improve the learning of your students? And if so, how do you know? And so what you need is data. You need data that you get from student feedback, from grades, from all sorts of different places. And I think that data takes time to gather, and over time, that will help you build future iterations of your assignments so that they're better for students, or your instructional materials so they're better. But I think one thing to try to do is, if you do have something like an assignment, is to run it by other staff. Have them take a look at it. And if you have something good, share it. Share it with other people. It'll make their lives a whole lot easier so they don't have to go through the whole process that you just went through to create this. So as I mentioned, I do have an assignment that I used in my previous life as a media arts teacher. This is a assignment that was built for Communication Technology 2215, otherwise known as photographic communication. And basically there's a preamble about what digital storytelling is and organizing things. And then I utilized an adapted version of Adobe's 7 Steps to Storytelling. And I'll add a copy of that to the comments in the video as well. So yeah, there's lots of information in here on how to go about doing it. It even breaks down, the amount of time or the technology tools that you're going to need, that sort of thing. And of course, this is something that can be adapted in your own environment as well. The other part of the assignment, obviously, is the assessment piece. And as you can see, it's broken down with the criteria, with the rubric, and an explanation of each of those criteria. Now, unfortunately, I didn't go into more detail in the rubric, but really what you should have is, in any rubric, you should have a template like this for your actual marking, and then another one that's filled with information under each category to demonstrate what the difference is, or what the expectation is specifically between, say, an excellent grade and one that needs improvement. And so I think one easy way to do this is you can just fill it in here, or better yet, link it directly to exemplars that have a marking sheet attached to them from previous students. And I think that's a really great way to provide examples for students so they can see what is expected when they're going to be producing something for a classroom. Because there's nothing worse than just being told, oh, you're going to get marked out of 10. and then not being told anything. In fact, if any K to 12 teacher did this in this province in Alberta, yeah, they wouldn't have a job at the end of the day. So yeah, this is something that is crucial to feedback. It is one method of feedback for students. Obviously, there's going to be the verbal feedback that you're going to give, and then other feedback too. You may want to make a copy of this so that students can do their own version of a self-assessment or critique. If you want to create good digital stories, there's definitely a method to it. If you do want to make a digital story and you are willing to try it out and you've never done it before, great. There's lots of resources out there, and I am more than happy to share any information that I have. So please comment on what you've seen. I know this has been a really lengthy talk on something that's very basic, and it's not a tutorial. That's the other thing I wanted to make sure that people understood. This isn't a tutorial on what you should use for your school, because I do not know what sort of software and hardware you have. But if you have questions that pertain to those things that are specific to your institution or your teaching assignment or whatever it is that you're doing in education, then talk to me and I can probably help you out.